Good day. Welcome to our study in the Gospel of John. Today we begin chapter 2. We're going to look at two texts today because they are intentionally juxtaposed. There we go. The wedding at Cana and the cleansing of the temple. Now, I just want to remind you again, what is it you think you know? Because what we're going to get is something happening in chapter 2 that should produce in us, as the reader of this text, the same kinds of reactions that we're going to see Nicodemus having. In other words, by the time we get to chapter 3, we should not be able to make a lot of sense here. Things should be a bit confusing, and Jesus is going to explain why. So what I'm not trying to do is make things confusing. I'm trying to allow the author now to do what the author is doing and creating this whole new way of thinking, this new logos, okay, this new structuring principle of reality, this new epistemology, this new hermeneutic. Throw in Tony Bartlett's wonderful work, and it's a new semiotics as well. What you have now, you've learned in this hymn, in the prologue, that you have this structuring principle of reality that's divine, that's the Son of God, that's this unique individual who's being identified all over the place in chapter 1 with all these great figures in Second Temple Judaism. People are first identifying the Baptist with that figure, but the Baptist says, no, I'm just bearing witness to the light. And then we get Jesus' first followers. And then, as I pointed out, not only do we have a third creation narrative in the Bible. This is the Christian creation narrative, John 1. It's the Christian creation narrative. And it's a retelling of these first two creation stories in a very real way. As I pointed out before, Genesis 1 is eschatological. It's beginning to end, and it's a story that does not have perfection built into it. It's not Platonic. Everything is tov tov. It is not yet tov tov tov. But Genesis 2, which is the story that Paul, Genesis 2 and 3, which Paul is going to use to discuss the breakdown of the cosmos. That same narrative, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, and both are important. They're not separate. Paul may talk about Adam, Christ, but he also references Cain with direct relationship to Adam, particularly in Romans 7, which is first a reflection on the Adamic narrative and then on the Cain narrative, okay? The writer of this gospel also deals with Cain, and the reference to Cain functions as the heart of the letter in 1 John chiastically. Don't be like Cain, who was a murderer. In other words, everything is about this founding murder. Even in this text, but in this text, this founding murder is given very concrete expression in a unique individual known as the Son of the Father, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph. And we now have these disciples gathering around him. Now, I mentioned that we have this week, perhaps. Some scholars certainly see a week here. We have the third day after the fourth day mentioned, so it's the seventh day. Some see this as the eighth day. Depends on if you have a Sabbath in between. However you want to play this thing, it doesn't matter. What the author's doing is talking about these absolutely new beginnings. Everything begins here with this logos. Everything begins here, not back in Genesis 1 and 2. Okay, everything begins here. And then we read Genesis 1 and 2 in light of this new logos, this logos NRK in the beginning. Then we can understand what's happening in Genesis 1 and 2, but not before. You don't go to Genesis 1 and 2 and add the prologue and the logos and Jesus of Nazareth to it. No, you interpret those texts, those early creation texts, through John 1. That's the Christian creation narrative, and it is a Christian creation narrative. And it's very important. And the creation narratives in Genesis are hugely important in 1,000 million ways. I'm not denigrating them, putting them down. The Gospel of John doesn't supersede them. It is a Christian hermeneutic approach to creation. And that's what this writer is doing. And that's why, again, as I pointed out, the tetelestai in John 19, it is finished, is the finishing of the creation in Christ, on the cross. The cross is the end of creation. It absolutely changes everything. And it's going to be the very place Jesus invites us to eat from in John 6. And now in this narrative, we're going to be invited to do what this author does so well. We're going to be making allusions. We're going to see things in this text, okay? And what this writer's trying, he's not asking you to do guesswork here. He's not asking you to go, oh, gee, let's see if I can find parallels anywhere. This is not what he's doing. He's going to tell this story of the wedding at Cana as the sign, the first sign Jesus does, and it's completely missed. It's hidden. You'll notice, if you know the story already, you'll notice in verse 11, this the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana and Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, who are these disciples? They're the disciples from chapter 1, and they're going to include this other disciple as well as Peter and Andrew and Nathaniel. We also have Jesus' mother there. It is important, as scholars note, to observe that Jesus' mother is never named in this gospel. This is, in John 19, the woman given to the beloved disciple, the person behind this gospel. But she's never named. I think that's going to be an important clue down the road as we talk about the identity of this beloved disciple and why even his identity is shrouded. And I use that as a pun, because if I'm speaking of Eleazar, as you know, or Lazarus, for him to be shrouded is to be in death. And it's possible that we will discover a reason for him to have changed his name. And perhaps the same was done with regard to Jesus' mother Miriam. On the third day, there was a marriage at Cana in Galilee. And this archaeologists think they've identified this as Kirbet Cana, up about 9 miles north of Nazareth. It's obvious from the text that Mary's known to the steward of the feast, because she can tell him, do whatever he says with regard to Jesus, and the steward's going to do it. The story, it has a number of interesting pieces to it that we won't go into too much. There's the whole thing about the dialogue between Mary and Jesus, when she says to him, they have no wine. They've run out of wine. We're at a marriage feast. They've run out of wine. And he says to her, "O woman, what have you to do with me?" This is a phrase in Greek. You find it in the Septuagint. It implies a distancing, and often or a few times can imply a rejection. In other words, she's asking him to fix the situation, to be a deus ex machina. And he says, what do you have? Well, what does that have to do with anything? You don't get it. This is not how I operate. And he says, my hour has not yet come. And this is the first time we're going to be introduced to this theme, and we're going to see it roll through the gospel, Jesus' hour. And where we're really going to see it is in chapter 12, when the Greeks come to Jesus and he says, my hour has come. So right now he's saying, my hour has not yet come. What is he referring to? What is this hour? This is the hour of his death, the hour of his crucifixion. And his reply to her is, they have no wine, is, I'm not ready to die. This is not my time to die. That's where the Johannine author's going. You don't see that on the surface of the text. Just, my time has not yet come. But that's the Johannine hour. His mother says to the servants, well, do whatever he tells you. She has no idea at this point what's going to happen. It's just, she puts it in Jesus' hands. She lets it go. Now the writer's going to give you what he's going to be doing here. It says Jesus-Moses parallelism. Remember, Torah comes through Moses, but grace and truth, covenant faithfulness and truthfulness come through Jesus Christ. Now 6 stone jars were standing there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So, there's between 108 and 160 something gallons water. And scholars debate, were they full, were they empty, had they been used, had they been that misses the whole point here. And they do it again when it's the water into wine. Did Jesus make 160 gallons of wine? Was it only the wine that actually came out in the scoop that and the rest was still water? They talk about trying to strain gnats and swallow camels. And you read this stuff in the commentaries and you just kind of go, oh, Lord have mercy, So you have 6 stone jars standing there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. What do you have here? What's the author trying to tell you? He's trying to signal to you that what you have here is Torah. These are jars for purification and cleansing. These are holiness codes. All of this stuff. Paul will include a zealous interpretation of Torah within that. He would see that here in these stone jars. Jesus says to them, fill the jars with water. Okay, now they're full. Okay. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out, take it to the steward of the feast. So they took the ladle, put some out, put it in a container, walked it up to the steward of the feast, who's sitting there happily celebrating everything. And who knows how many sheets to the wind he is, but evidently he's doing a very good job because these feasts lasted for days. He's kind of like Adam Sandler in The Wedding Manager, or whoever played the wedding manager in that girly flick. He says, when the steward of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from. Now you're going to get this phrase all the time to Jesus. Where do you come from? 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 Steward of the feast did not know where it came from. And this ignorance theme is going to get picked up in chapter 3 with Nicodemus. He doesn't know anything about this. He's clueless. The steward of the feast called the bridegroom. Now that's the guy that's responsible to fund this thing. Make sure that everything keeps going, and he says to him, every wedding I've ever been to serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely and they really don't care what they're drinking, but they just want to keep a buzz going, and then they pour the poorer wine, and people just don't really care anymore because it's all about the buzz. But you've kept the good wine until now. And all of a sudden, everything changes. There's a whole new perspective on this party. You see what I'm saying? The best is for last. It's first, it's last. It comes out first by the bridegroom. Then they switch it to even better. It's just amazing. Now this is the author's comment. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Again, that's the goal of the book, that you may hear this, see this, listen to this testimony, and believe. It says his disciples believed in him. It doesn't say which ones. Are we to assume all believed in him? Do we understand this to mean that all the disciples saw it? Why is it not in the synoptic gospels is my question. This is the first of his miracles. Peter's there at the beginning. Surely it's got to make an impression on him if he knows. So I'm not so certain about when it says his disciples, it refers to them all. One does tend to think that this miracle was perhaps, it's not miracle, wrong term. This sign was done undercover, and perhaps only a few saw. We're going to continue by observing that this text has, again, like the Logos, two very important backgrounds. Let's remember, it's being written in Greek in Asia Minor, okay? To Jews, by Jews, but in Asia Minor. Let's remember this. In his commentary, Andrew Lincoln brings out really in some pretty fine detail for several pages that what you have here is an allusion to the Dionysius tradition, or Bacchus, the god of wine, and that Jesus is indeed the god of wine, the god of true wine. Now, all your commentators are going to observe all the wine sayings in the synoptics, new wineskins. Jesus, is the bridegroom. They're celebrating the marriage feast. You got the marriage feast of the Lamb in the Revelation. You've got the Messianic feast of Isaiah 25, where on that eschatological day when everything's reconciled, redeemed, restored, whatever, there will be a fine feast with fine wines. You have this imagery of wine that runs through both the Jewish and the Greek traditions. What is important here also is a motif about wine as blood. There is not going to be a Christian in the Johannine community who reads this story without connecting wine and blood. Now, what's interesting is your Catholic commentators all observe this, but your Protestants don't. So Lincoln passes it by. G.R. Beasley, Murray, the Evangelical, there's no perspective here that what we're dealing with on another level for the Johannine community, because of their understanding that everything is read under the cross. This is the first sign that points to this big sign at the end, the seventh sign, the cross. This is the first sign, and it's going to have a direct connection to that sign, and that sign is blood, wine and blood. Where's the parallel? Of course, it's from Exodus, where Moses turns the water into blood. Jesus turns the water into wine, but he also turns the wine into his blood. And now you have the liturgical connection and the non-sacrificial shift away from this wrath of God Exodus thinking to this blessing of God logic, where that which is life comes through the death of the Son. That which is life comes through the death of the Son. We humans derive life from the death of others, our scapegoats. We make gods out of them. This is René Girard's thesis on transcendence. We create religions out of our scapegoats. The scapegoat is the first polyvalent symbol, that which is both is and is not. A symbol is beyond word equals thing. Book, coffee, apple, eye. A symbol is the apple of my eye. That's a symbol. We humans can do that. Apes can't do that. We are the ones that first demonized, and then as a result of the peace and harmony that came about in the hominization processes, we're becoming humans. We attribute all the cooperation and goodness we feel because we've gotten rid of all our crap out onto the scapegoat. And we attribute we feel better now. We feel like our bowels are empty, and our emotional bowels, we just pooped all over the victim. John Paul calls this sacrificial mechanism a toilet. It's a flushing mechanism. It flushes the violence out of the system. When there's too much violence, there's a need for scapegoats. We flush the violence out of the system. We create symbols, demonize them, divinize them. And out of these symbols, this sacrificial process comes language and myth and story and the way we construct our reality. And this author's turning all of that around with this new Logos. And he's coming in here and he's saying you have got to radically rethink this whole business of how you understand the first sign, the wedding at Cana, the turning of water into wine. There's something much more happening here, and every Johannine Christian would know that. Jesus is manifesting his glory glory, his doxa, that which we have seen as a term that is used with reference to the utter humiliation of the cross. This text is about Jesus' death. My hour has not yet come. Water, wine, blood. And furthermore, the Jesus-Moses parallelism. Now, T.F. Glasson, in his book Moses and the Fourth Gospel, makes this observation. In the story of the miracle at Cana, the water pots are described as set there after the Jews' manner of purifying, so that in a sense they symbolize the external cleansing prescribed in the law as contrasted with the festive wine brought by Jesus. Wine itself and rabbinic teaching symbolize the Torah. And so the whole story suggests that the true wine is the gift of Jesus. And then he cites Exodus Rabbah 25:7. So this is the Midrash. It's volume 3 on Exodus. It's the Exodus Rabbah. So when we go to 25:7, the rabbis here have pieced together. They're all exegeting this text, and you have one explanation after another, after another, after another. In chapter 25, when Moses, then the Lord said unto Moses, Behold, I will cause to rain bread from heaven for you. And we are now on the 7th explanation. That is, all the things the rabbis concocted about, and how they read texts is fascinating. You'll see this, how they read texts. You will learn in this lesson at least how a second or third century rabbi interpreted texts. How do Jews read texts? What I'd like to do is read the entire text. It's a fairly long paragraph, but I'm just simply going to read it. And since the rabbis are quoting a lot of biblical text, I'm going to end each biblical text quote with the words quote unquote. Another explanation of Behold, I will cause to rain bread from heaven for you. It is written, quote, Come eat of my bread and drink of the wine which I have mingled, Proverbs 9:15, unquote. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, quote, What enabled you to eat of the manna and drink from the well? The fact that you accepted the statutes and ordinances. For it says, quote, There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, Exodus 25:25, end quote. So, quote, Because you have accepted my food, have you received the food of the manna, and because, quote, of the wine which I have mingled, quote, have you drunk of the water of the well, as it says, quote, and drink of the wine which I have mingled. Why was no song uttered over the manna, as over the well? You know the song, Spring up, O well, within my soul. Because the manna that spoke disrespectfully, for it says, because of the manna they spoke disrespectfully, for it says, but now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all. Numbers 11:6. God said, I desire neither your complaints nor praises. For this reason did he allow them to utter song only over the well, which they loved, as it says, quote, Spring up, O well, sing ye unto it. End quote. Another explanation of Behold, I will cause to rain bread from heaven for you, and then we move on. Now, in this explanation, there are several fascinating things. The first is you'll notice the what we would call the rabbis' use of text. Some would call it proof texting. They would call it exegesis. This is that is, they have rules for hermeneutics and exegesis. Hillel had 8 or 13 of them. These are not unknown rules. There are rules for interpretation at Qumran. It's not as though people interpreted the text willy-nilly in Jesus' day. They certainly didn't, but they interpreted it within various hermeneutical frameworks, and this is one of them. Now, what's important here is that we are, drinking with the notion of the manna in the wilderness, the bread. We're dealing with the well. The Torah, which is called wine, that is, that you're drinking from the Torah, and what you're drinking are the statutes and commandments. When you keep them, you're drinking the Torah, the wine of the Torah, which is also identified with the well. Moses strikes the rock, and out come water and blood. But in this case, it's identified with wine. Water, blood, wine. Water, blood, wine. Do you see these? Do you see this? Do you see the fourth gospel? If you haven't gotten this yet, just go right to 1 John, where there are three witnesses: the water, the blood, the Spirit. I mean, this is the way this writer's thinking. He's moving in this direction, you see. And so Glasson's insight, I think, is important. You'll also recall that in this gospel, in addition to being branches on the vine from which the wine is made, and the vines have branches that bear fruit, in addition to that, we are the ones who are going to be crushed. Just as you crush grapes to make wine, Christians are crushed. Jesus is crushed to make wine. Christians are crushed. In this world you will have persecution, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world, John 16:33. The writer's trying to move you this way. You don't know all of this stuff yet, but he's moving you to think in these thematic, broad-based Jewish ways of making connections, and they all come back to the temple. These are all temple themes, all of these themes. Remember, over the Holy of Holies is this enormously constructed vine of gold, and I mean, it's lavish, it's beautiful, it's well known, it's huge, it's huge. It's a vine right there. And then, of course, you have the lectionary texts. When we'll come to one of these sets of lectionary texts when we come to John 7:37 and the Feast of the Tabernacles, and the use of these well texts, these water texts at that point. So the writer has this rich background that he's just with simple ways and an interconnected theological model, he's making allusions everywhere. And so as these jars represent holiness codes and a certain particular interpretation of Torah, so too this water becomes not wrath, blood, blessing, but wine, which becomes blood, which becomes blessing. There is this intermingling of all these themes as we move through this gospel, but Lincoln is correct to observe that we're also dealing here with the Greco-Roman Dionysius myth, and that the abundance theme at the end would absolutely signal that Jesus is God, the God of wine. And I think for any Greek reader, that's going to be very important, because it establishes that Jesus is a beneficent God, an abundant God, a giving God. And that's what that establishes in the text. Now, we run into a major conundrum here. It's 28 minutes. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through this by 45 minutes, and that's as long as I really wanted to make any of these. In fact, I wanted to make them 30 minutes, so maybe I should stop here, because the next story is the so-called cleansing of the temple. I never liked that term, because Jesus is not cleansing anything. It should be described as Jesus' prophetic act of shutting down the temple. That's what it should be called. But it's not, because we still are sacrificial in our thinking, and we have to have a place for sacrifice, and we have to believe Jesus had a place for sacrifice, when in fact Jesus rejected the sacrificial apparatus, and he's about to do so right now. And it's more than just, if you read the text, it's more than just the fact that there are animals being sold in the temple courts. The issue is much bigger, and I think we'll wait until next time, because we do need to talk about all the various reactions in various groups to the temple in Jerusalem. And it may take 2 lessons to actually deal with that, because we're also dealing with the fact that John puts this narrative right up front, immediately in the first week of Jesus' ministry, whereas the Synoptic Gospels have it at the end, in the last week of Jesus' ministry. There's no way this event occurred twice, that they're too similar. And so a question of historicity arises, and I do want to tackle that and share with you my perspective. So since we're now at almost 30 minutes, I think we'll just leave the wedding at Cana for today, and we'll tackle the story of the cleansing of the temple in the next 1 or 2, we'll see how long it takes me to do it, narratives until we get to Nicodemus. Wish you well today. Hope you had a good time with the wedding. I do want to mention, you know what, I'm rushing myself. I don't want to do that. I have a few other things I want to mention. I don't know if you're familiar with the term chiasmus or chiasmus, Chiamus. It's a literary technique. It's an oral technique used all over the Bible, used in Jewish oral tradition, used in Greek writing. And it allows for a story to be told and have a center, and it allows the story to be easily remembered because you're going A, B, C, and then B prime, A prime. So if you make the letter A, the letter B, the letter C, and then a B with a dash after it, not a dash, but an apostrophe, and then a C with an apostrophe, those are called B prime, C prime. So A, B, C, B prime, A prime. And the A's will have themes in common or words in common, and the B's will have themes or words in common, and the C is what you're working toward and then what you're working back away from. And so let me give you an example of a simple A-B-B-A chiasmus. Don't cast your pearls before swine, or throw your jewels before dogs, lest they turn and rend you and trample them under their feet. Now, the A, that is, don't throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under your feet, belong together, and or cast your jewels before dogs, lest they turn and rend you. That's the dogs. A, B, B, A. It's a chiastic pattern, and you find that all over the Gospels. Kenneth Bailey, some of you know, is a writer who has recognized this particular pattern in Jesus' parables, and I think is able to make a fairly reasonably excellent argument that Jesus' parables are structured this way. He also sees it in the larger structure of the Gospel of Luke. A pioneer in this field was the Swedish Covenanter Nils Lund, who back in the 1940s wrote his book Chiasmus in the New Testament. Joachim Jeremias recognizes this particular form in his work, and others do as well. Ellen Culpepper has shown the chiastic structure of the prologue of the Gospel of John. Peter F. Ellis, in his book, The Genius of John, makes a case that the whole Gospel is structured chiastically, and he does the same for the letters of Paul as well in his commentary on the letters of Paul. So chiasmus it's a recognized form, okay? Now, if indeed Ellis contends that the Cana narrative has a chiastic structure to a narrative at the end where you have a Mary in the garden, another Mary, and you have, and I need let me get my Bible ready for this because it's tough to find a small book in the Old Testament when you're looking for it, like Song of Solomon. I just keep zinging right by. I am looking for Song of Solomon. Ellis points out that you have a number of major terms used here. Woman in John 4 and in John 20, woman, what do you seek? You have, as he puts it, let me just grab that again and try to hold my place here in this other text. Both oh shoot, I'm not going to be able to find what I had read earlier because I am racing myself through this. Oh, here it is. Okay, so he observes the chiastic parallels between the wedding at Cana and the sequence in chapter 20 where Mary comes to Jesus in the garden. He says there's the intriguing possibility that John has utilized in chapter 21 through 18 the nuptial language of the Canticle of Canticles in order to create a broad parallel with the nuptial situation of chapter 2. Now, I'd like to read for you this text from Song of Solomon. because I think it is indeed possible that it's not that the writer's creating a fictitious encounter, but he's using this language to create this encounter to help us, again, make the connections back to Cana. So here's Canticle of Canticles. And I want you to think about Mary in the garden. She's looking for Jesus. She can't find him. Upon my bed by night, I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets, and in the squares. I will seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. The watchmen found me as they went about in the city. Have you seen him whom my soul loves? Now, goes on, scarcely had I passed them when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go until I brought him into my mother's house and the chamber of her that conceived me, yada, yada, yada. Now, very similar themes to the story here in chapter 20. These are nuptial themes. Song of Solomon is a song about the love and sex, the wedding bed, marriage, the tenderness of life, the couples share together, the pleasures of life. It's also perhaps a bit of an allegory, or certainly meant to be read in another level, but I'm not going to attempt that here because 1,000 different writers attempted it during the Middle Ages, and I don't know that they helped us all that much. Do you know the most commented on book in the Middle Ages was the Song of Solomon? I mean, 1,000 commentaries written. Everybody and their brother in those monasteries comment on the Song of Solomon. It's like their Harlequin lover novel, you know. Sorry, I did not just go there. Okay, back to John chapter 2. So I want you to keep in mind the possibility that we have the Mary story at the end as an echo of this particular Cana story, the retelling of it, where Jesus has to say to Mary, now you have to let go of me. You have to let go of me. And who is being let go? Well, when we get there, we're going to find something absolutely fascinating about what this writer's trying to do in connecting the historical Jesus and the living Lord together for us as the counselor who is with us, the Paraclete. But we're nowhere near there yet. So I found a we'll save that. We'll save that for next time. Okay, let me wish you well. Take care. Peace and love now. Hope you enjoyed the wedding at Cana. Bye now.